Hello students. Today we'll be discussing the topic Marxist philosophy of capitalism. In order to facilitate better understanding of this concept, I have divided the entire discussion into a number of areas. We would first start with the origin of capitalism and the concept of capitalism. Then we would focus on the 6 pillars of capitalism. Then the Marxian analysis of capitalism, and after that we focus on contradictions within capitalism, capitalism and class conflict, positive attributes of capitalism, and finally, capitalism and the Marxian state. Before we move on with the concept of capitalism, it is imperative to understand Marx as a philosopher. Karl Heinrich Marx was truly the last of the great critics in Western intellectual tradition. His ideas exerted a decisive influence on all aspects of human enterprise and transformed the study of history, society, polity, and economy. They significantly changed anthropology, arts, cultural studies, history, and sociology by bringing about a linkage between economics and intellectual life. Marx compiled a number of writings where he published the most important one with Engels, the Communist Manifesto, and Capital in a number of volumes. Marx died before the 3rd volume was published, and the 3rd volume of Capital was published by his friend Friedrich Engels posthumously. Coming to the etymological orientation of capitalism. The exact origin of the term capitalism in English is unclear. And it is certain that Marx was not the first philosopher to use this term in his writings. Although he definitely contributed to the use and interest in this concept. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the English word capitalism was first used by author William Thackeray in 1854 in his novel The Newcomes, and he intended to use this word as a sense of concern about personal possessions and money in general. While it's unclear whether Thackeray and Marx was unaware of each other's work, but both of them definitely utilized this concept in a pejorative sense. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, in his Wealth of Nations, wrote about the capitalist economic system, and Karl Marx was well aware of Adam Smith's writings. The meaning of capitalism, let us try to understand that. Capitalism is often thought of as an economic system in which private actors own and control property in accordance with their interests, and demand and supply freely set prices in markets in a way that they serve the interest of the society. The essential feature of capitalism is to make profit. As Adam Smith, the great 18th century economist and the father of modern economics said, I quote Adam Smith, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. Both parties to a voluntary exchange transaction have their own interest in the outcome, but neither can obtain what he or she wants without addressing what the other wants. It is this rational self-interest that can lead to economic prosperity." Unquote. Capitalism, according to theorists, emerged during the 16th century and accelerated during the Industrial Revolution, propelled by colonialism, the factory system, and definitely the Atlantic slave trade system. While the capitalist system generated wealth and prestige for the owners of the means of production, it often did so by exploiting those with little or no power, such as the factory people, laborers who worked in these factories, and many people indigenous to Africa and to America. Capitalism's expansion in 19th century America relied on economic growth generated through the labor of the enslaved people or land forcibly taken from the Native Americans. Now, students, so far we know that capitalism is a system of production where the means of production are owned by few. There are 6 pillars of capitalism. Let us study them one by one. Firstly, capitalism focuses on private property. In other words, property owned by a small segment of the society who utilize this property for their self-interest is at the core of capitalism. The second pillar of capitalism is self-interest. People work, accumulate means of production for their own self-interest. The third pillar of capitalism is competition. You have a number of players in the market who compete with one another to control the price and the products. And it works in the welfare of the producers. The fourth pillar of capitalism is a market mechanism. Rather, existence of a market platform is the very essence of a capitalist system. A market that determines prices in a decentralized manner through interactions between the buyers and the sellers, prices in return lead to allocation of resources which naturally seek the highest reward. So, existence of market is the fourth pillar. Fifthly, freedom to choose is another very important pillar of capitalism. Here we refer to freedom to choose what we will consume, what we will produce, what we will sell. In other words, the capitalists have the freedom to produce. In other words, important questions like what to produce, how much to produce, when to produce is the essence of a capitalist system. The next important pillar of capitalism, students, is a limited role of the government or government not interfering in market mechanism. It is also believed that government is the best government that interferes the least in the market mechanism. We also know it in the terms of the laissez-faire system. Now we need to understand that the 6 pillars operate under different conditions. For example, in the free market system, or as I just said about the laissez-faire system, where you have the market operates freely, the state interference is minimum. On the other hand, we have another type of system where we have the mixed economic system, where we have the coexistence of the private and the public players. Here you have a blended role. The state acts as a regulator and the market is not kept free of the interference of the state. Now, let us move on to another understanding of capitalism where Marx analyzed capitalism as a stage of history. Now, we had already studied Marxian analysis of the 5 stages of history where we have understood that the first stage was primitive communism, then was the age of slavery, then was the feudal age, then the capitalist age, and finally the socialist and the communist stage. So here we find capitalism was a stage where we had large-scale factory production system and there were existence of 2 antagonistic classes, the class of the haves and the class of the have-nots. The relationship between them was one of domination and subjugation or subordination. Now, in the capitalist stage, the mode of production determined the relations between the capitalist and the wage workers. Now, while elaborating on this in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels elaborated how capitalism was unsustainable and how the capitalist society, which existed at the time of the writing of the Communist Manifesto, would eventually be replaced by a socialist one. Let us now move on to Marxian analysis of capitalism. Now, Marx stressed upon the fact that capitalism is a historical one. In other words, Marx does not consider individual members of the society as his unit of analysis. He speaks in terms of the entire society. To him, capitalism is that stage of the development of human society which arises from the contradictions of a previous stage. And the previous stage was the feudal stage, according to Marx, where we have the oppression of the serfs by the feudal laws. But in the capitalist stage, Marx emphasized again and again that the labor force was inevitable for the sustainability of the capitalist system, because large-scale production system cannot operate without the existence of a wage labor class. Coming to the main features of capitalism. Tom Bottomer, in his work, A Dictionary of Marxist Thought, elaborated on a number of crucial features on which capitalism sustained itself. Let us go into what Bottomer has to say about the capitalist interpretation as provided by Marx. Firstly, capitalism works on the principle that production is for sale rather than for self-use. By this he meant that under capitalism, the productive processes shifted from the subsistence system to a large-scale production system. So, primitive methods of means of production shifted to more mechanized means of technological production. Production was also not for consumption. Production was for other use, for the consumption of the entire society. Because there was a rationale for it. The technology was so advanced that it inevitably resulted in large-scale factory production system which has to be sold off, unlike the previous subsistence economic system. Second feature of capitalism was the existence of a market where labor power was bought and sold. Now, here you need to understand that Marx emphasized on workers in terms of their labor power. The capitalists or the owners of the means of production hired their labor power by paying them wages. Workers could sell their labor power according to the wages offered to them, and they were legally free to work under the different capitalist owners. However, unlike the previous stages of history, workers were not forced to work like slaves or serfs. But economic needs forced them to work in the factory production system. So, although they were legally free to enter into wage laboring system, they were not free not to work because starvation, hunger forced them to work within the large-scale production system. The next important feature of capitalism was an exchange takes place through money. So, money was the medium through which goods were produced and sold. And as a result, students, financial institutions came up in a big way. The importance of financial institutions in capitalism cannot be undermined or neglected. The next important feature of capitalism was that the capitalists controlled the production process. This implies that not only does the capitalist control the hiring and firing of workers, they also decide how much production is to be carried out, when the production process will start and end. Therefore, the major questions relating to production were decided by the owners of the means of production, in short, the factory owners. Next important feature was the capitalists controlled the financial decisions. Now, this is quite related to the earlier point that we just mentioned, decisions regarding prices of the product, wages to be paid to the laborers, the amount of financial investment that could be made in a particular production system were to be decided by the capitalist and capitalist alone. Coming to the next feature of capitalism was competition between capitals. Since the whole idea of capitalism is based on production for sale, there is bound to be competition among the different production houses. Who is going to produce at what rate? It is to be decided by the different owners of the means of production, but then there was a competition in the market to ensure that their respective produce was sold in maximum quantity. Thus, we find different types of markets emerging under the capitalist system. Students, Marx defined capitalism by two factors. One, wage labor, and second, private accumulation of capital. By wage labor, Marx in his Capital pointed out that capitalism arises only when the means of production and subsistence meet in the market with laborer selling their labor power. So only accumulation of capital or only possessing the means of production does not work in capitalism. Secondly, Marx emphasized on private ownership of means of production. Now, there is a difference between private ownership of means of production and personal ownership of means of production, like house, other consumption products. Now, he believed that ownership of the means of production was a feature of capitalism, and ownership had to be restricted to a chosen few. Those who did not own anything were forced to sell their labor power and work in the factories of the capitalists. Associated with the concept of capitalism is class conflict. Capitalism, according to Marx, symbolizes the most acute form of exploitation, inequalities, and polarization of classes. The concept of class conflict is inherent in capitalism, and the conflict is between the capitalists and the wage laborers. According to Marx, the history of human society is the history of class struggle, and this class struggle becomes acute when the capitalists carry out undaunted domination and exploitation over the wage laborers. Each stage in human history is marked by a division of society between haves and the have-nots, those who dominate and those who are subordinated. The very foundation of capitalism survives, according to Marx, on the existence of private property, mass production of commodities under the factory system for profit-making, and the existence of a working class who is forced to sell their labor power in the market, leading to polarization of classes. Now, as capitalism progresses, these class divisions become wider. The interest of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat become more and more separate and acute. The proletariat becomes unified. After all, they share the same problems and seek the same solutions. So here we have, with the course of history, proletariats emerging out to be organized and powerful. A class in itself becomes a class for itself. The revolution of the proletariat will, according to Marx, bring about a new phase in history, where the owners of the means of production will be the workers themselves. Marx also clearly pointed out to another phenomena. He referred to it as the contradictions within capitalism. Marx believed that contradictions of the previous stage resulted in the new stage. But capitalism was also beset with inner contradictions. And these contradictions get reflected in intense forms of class conflict. After all, the means of production are concentrated in a few hands. The labor power is considered only in terms of labor power which can be bought and sold in the wage market. The inequalities actually accelerate class conflict. Next important aspect, which is very interesting to note, is that despite the fact that Marx recognized capitalism as perpetuating inequalities, polarizing among classes, but he was a realist to point this out, that capitalism also had certain positive attributes which cannot be undermined. Firstly, capitalism brought about remarkable economic progress by revolutionizing the means of production and developing technology as never before. It built and encouraged the growth of commerce, factories on a scale unknown before. Secondly, capitalism was cosmopolitan and international. It undermined national barriers. The capitalists, in the search for new resources, new areas, started enlarging the purview of capitalism. And thirdly, capitalism also undermined national barriers in the sense that capitalism also led to the growth of an urban civilization. It led to the rise of the towns and cities where the laborers migrated from the villages and went and settled down in the cities. Marx refers to this entire phenomena of movement of the peasants from the rural areas to the urban areas as the idiocy of rural life. In summation, capitalism revolutionized the techniques of economic production, reduced international barriers, and created an urban civilization. In spite of these achievements, Marx contended that capitalism had outlived its importance, its use, because of the sufferings and the hardships that it imposed upon the millions. Therefore, he suggested that a new socialist organization will be able to root out these evils inherent within the capitalist system. Marx also focused on the sufferings within capitalism. Some of the sufferings that he elaborated on are the eviction of the peasants from their land, the loss of their sources of income, their assembling in the cities and become dependent on wage laborers, and most significantly, capitalism led to the creation of this proletariat class. Another very significant tendency that capitalism led was alienation of the worker. Now, what is alienation of the worker and what did Marx provide for? To Marx, labor has to be satisfying and fulfilling. But within the capitalist system, this was not possible because of division of labor and specialization of systems. So much so that the laborer produced only a small part in the entire production process, which he could not call his own. In other words, a laborer had no right to the artistic creation of the entire product because he was only contributing to a small portion of the entire product or produce. So what happened was that the laborer had no control on the final product also, and as a result, the laborers were divided and it set them one against the other. So the workers never conceived of a product, a produce, as a great collective human project. More so, the workers also lost their interest in the production system. They lost their ability to be creative. They lost their ability to own the products for they were willing to be. Ultimately, what happened was that they were enslaved by this entire capitalist process. In fact, this entire process, Marx calls it commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism is one of Marx's most consistently enduring ideas, and it is surprisingly accessible. Commodity fetishism is a condition in which production is no longer seen as a social endeavor, but simply as an exchange of money and commodities. Under commodity fetishism, commodities themselves are in competition with each other, and commodity fetishism ends up transforming the entire social order, and you can see it in its most acute form in today's world. So it leads to confusion of the true relationship between humans to the production system. Next, we move on to another very persistent area in capitalism is capitalism and class inequalities. The early liberals were confident that economic inequalities were understandable. Economic inequalities in course of time will bring about economic prosperity, which will reduce the diversity or the distance between the haves and the have-nots. Marx, however, pointed out that the gulf between the rich and the poor would forever widen under the capitalist system. In fact, capitalism by itself encouraged inequalities and consumerism. Commodities assumed personalities of their own. Poverty and affluence became relative categories within capitalism. For human needs became just social by their nature. Therefore, Marx opined that unless private property was abolished, the workers would never be truly free. But once this was achieved, by a revolution where capitalism will collapse and the establishment of a socialist system will bring about equalities in society, which will be a cooperative endeavor. Another very important point to note here, students, is the capitalist crisis. Marx asserted that capitalism contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. He rallied the working class behind the call, "Workers of all countries unite," a phrase he borrowed from Karl Schrapper. Within capitalism, with increase in monopolies leading to growing exploitation, inequalities, misery, and pauperization of the working class would become organized, more consolidated, and with the increase in their number, they would acquire greater bargaining skill. This was foretold by Marx, where he said that this was the beginning of a revolutionary process, which would lead to ultimately a new socialist arrangement in which common possession would replace private ownership of means of production. And here what we find that capitalism would no longer be in existence. Now, so far we have understood capitalism from various dimensions. We would finally focus on the nature of the state in the capitalist society. Marx said in a number of his writings that the state was an instrument of class rule. State was an agency at the hands of the capitalist class to perpetuate their exploitation. However, his remarks on this area of the capitalist state is embedded in various discussions across his different writings. But one thing was common in all his writings, that the state was simply a tool, an instrument controlled by the economically dominant class in their own interest at the expense of the working class. Based on what we have studied so far, let us quickly conclude our discussion on the Marxian analysis of capitalism. Karl Marx views capitalism as one of the stages in history where the exploitation would reach a stage where it would contain the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism perpetuated inequalities on a very, very large scale. And finally, capitalism was beset with class contradictions, inequalities, pauperization, and this brought about large-scale contradictions within the propertied as well as the propertyless class. This is all about the Marxian analysis of capitalism. Thank you.